All right, so in this video, we're going to talk about Russia's legislative branch. So first of all, we're going to examine some of the characteristics of the legislative branch within Russia. First of all, we would say it is not necessarily a rubber stamp legislature, but definitely aligned, subservient to Vladimir Putin and the executive branch within Russia. So Putin's party, United Russia, holds the overwhelming majority within the Duma. And the Duma is really seen as oftentimes carrying out the initiative of the executive branch without a whole lot of pushback. So maybe not to the extent of China in terms of rubber stampedness, but definitely aligned as subservient to Vladimir Putin at the time. So it is bicameral, consisting of the Duma and the Federation Council. So each of these have different purposes. It's not necessarily a House of Commons, House of Lords situation. They do both do different important things. But the Duma primarily serves as the lawmaking body in the place where legislation is initiated and the place where legislation comes from. And the Federation's Council serves a different purpose that we'll talk about. And Russia also has sub-state legislatures on a regional basis. So you can think of all the different variations of sub-state units that exist within Russia under sort of the asymmetrical federalist system. And most of those have some sort of legislature that play parts in local governance, but also play a part in choosing the Federation Council members. So the first one we are going to look at is the Duma. So the Duma, as we said before, is really the lawmaking kind of apparatus within Russia, and generally speaking, as a weak check on executive power. And so some different options. Vladimir Putin can specifically initiate legislation himself, but most of the time, kind of the initiation of legislation is done by his allies within the legislature, which consists mostly of his party. So the Duma is the lower house within the kind of the legislative system. And really what I think is interesting is it has almost a sort of House of Representatives type feel compared to the Federation Council, which is chosen in some part kind of the same way that the U.S. used to choose its senators pre-1912 when state legislatures would choose its senators. So the Duma itself has 450 deputies. One thing that's worth pointing out is they are mostly men, so about 15.8% women, which is fairly low. Russia has a mixed electoral system. So we're going to look at the different electoral systems that Russia has had throughout the years. But currently, at the time we are talking, which is January 15th, 2021, so mark that for the posterity of time, they have a first past the post. Half the seats are elected by first past the post single member district. And then half the seats are elected through a proportional representation system in which parties choose members that represent them. So that is done simultaneously. So half the seats through first past the post, half the seats through proportional representation. So Russia has had a lot of different types of electoral systems. I usually have to write them all down in order to get it right in my head. But they have had proportional representation. They've had a mixed system. They had proportional representation again. I think at some point they had first past the post solely. And this is where they currently are at. And oftentimes changes are made to benefit the leading party, which is United Russia, which is aligned with Putin. So members in the Duma serve 5-year terms. They do, the typical legislative things, pass bills, approve budgets, confirm presidential appointments, things like that. And you have to be at least 21 to serve in the Duma. So this is akin in a lot of ways to the House of Representatives in the United States, the Chamber of the House and in Nigeria, the Chamber of Deputies in Mexico, kind of the lower house, right? But powers are limited. So for one thing, when we kind of thinking about when we talked about the executive branch, the president can rule by decree. So that, of course, gives limited oversight by the legislature. The Duma, there are some really interesting things within the government that are, kind of a nod to some of its parliamentary leanings. The Duma can technically remove the prime minister that the president chooses. But this initiates a situation in which the Duma, if they reject the prime minister 3 times, then the president can dissolve the Duma, and it's a big old mess. So kind of attempts to do this have failed. And one thing that's worth pointing out is that Duma does actually have the power to impeach the president. So this actually happened in the 90s. There was a lot of conflict between the executive branch and the legislative branch in the time of Boris Yeltsin, where there was a lot of messiness in terms of Russia's kind of early stumbling toward democracy. But the impeachment process is very cumbersome, has a very high bar, and is hard to see that currently happening. And this quote came from the website of the Duma. I thought that was kind of interesting. The purpose of modern Russian legislation is to identify needs for the regulation of public relations, ensuring the scientific validity and effectiveness of lawmaking activity in changing reality and meeting new challenges. So I thought that was, especially the changing reality part, I thought was interesting. And these are the current, kind of the current setup, straight off the Wikipedia presses. 336 united Russian members. So that is Vladimir Putin. A lot of parties that are aligned with Putin's party. So there's this other party called the Liberal Democrats, and they are the light blue. So they are also sort of part of the governing coalition, and they're sort of neither liberal nor Democrats by anyone's standards, but they are called the Liberal Democrats. And you have the Communist Party, which has 43, and they are the faithful opposition within the system, we'll say. All right, so going to the other house is the Federation Council, and things get a little bit trickier with the Federation Council. They are less typical of a legislature and have some interesting foibles. So they represent, in a lot of ways, the way to think of the Federation Council is they are really connected to the federal structure of Russia. So they represent specific regions, and they have 2 members from each of the individual federal subunits. So one is chosen by the governor, and then one is chosen by the regional legislature. And if you can kind of think back to the executive branch video, we have changed they have changed the system in which governors are appointed from being directly elected to being appointed by Putin. So as you can imagine, this sort of perverts the system in a lot of ways in which a lot of people that are very well connected to the government and have a lot of close ties to the leadership of the country. So the Federation Council has the power to delay bills. So that is House of Lords like in its nature. But they do more than House of Lords. They approve presidential decrees and appointees. Interestingly, they can change boundaries among republics. So there is a lot of ways in which the Federation Council does a lot of sort of the dirty work inside the country in terms of solving disputes between the different regions, of which I think there are many, because a lot of these kind of operate with some autonomy and kind of butt up against each other sometimes. And the Federation Council is also more connected with kind of the use of armed forces, like actually approving it and being associated with the discharge of armed forces outside of the country and actually being I don't know if it's necessarily the power to declare war that we would say, but they sort of ratify what is being done outside of the country by the armed forces. And they also have the power to remove and appoint judges. So a lot of things that we would associate maybe with an upper house, and some similarities with the Senate in the United States and the Senate in Mexico, the Senate in Nigeria. All right. So those are the 2 houses. Thanks. Bye.